I'm James Doohan. In the next hour, we'll examine the controversial evidence and theories that suggest we're not alone in the universe. If these theories prove to be true, the implications are staggering. In recent times, there have been more reported UFO sightings than ever before. For centuries, these crafts have remained a mystery until now. The footage you're about to see is a startling photographic account that sheds light on the greatest question of our century. Are we really alone? In the past decade, over 15 million people have reportedly witnessed extraterrestrial craft. What's more remarkable is that contemporary science has ignored the evidence that for thousands of years has been in plain sight. Recently in Mexico City, millions of astonished onlookers watched as these and other craft hovered over their city for hours. It was the largest mass UFO sighting in history. Mexican officials even held press conferences asking the public to remain calm. What's more amazing is that these sightings are still occurring even today. In what may be one of the most revealing interviews of our time, nuclear physicist Bob Lazar speaks candidly about his top secret work at the government's saucer research facility known as Area S4. In 1989, he was hired by the military to back-engineer the propulsion system of an extraterrestrial craft.
Obviously, the ET craft do exist. Something had to build them, so there must be aliens. And since there are, and the craft were there must be some sort of factory and an entire civilization somewhere. And if in fact that is true, and it apparently is, then there must be others.
Contact cases are by far the rarest type of UFO sighting. In these instances, a ship or a number of ships are repeatedly sighted by a single witness over an extended period of time. Over the last several years, a Miami resident named Adrienne had what is now considered one of the best documented contact cases in history. At first, the sightings began occurring at some distance from his home, but it wasn't long before the craft began appearing over his backyard. This amazing video footage shows a glowing disc approximately 9 feet in diameter hovering just feet from his house. In a blink of an eye, the craft disappears. Once the footage is slowed down, we can clearly see the craft dematerialize frame by frame. Adrienne's contact case took place over a period of several years and was never reported to the authorities for fear of ridicule and reprisals. Among the numerous hours of footage taken, this sighting remains one of the most dramatic. It began at 10:03 p.m. on October the 20th, 1995, and took place over a 50-minute period. The encounter ended with Adrienne following the craft at high speeds down the freeway. Here we see the craft minutes after the sighting begins. This extraordinary footage has never been broadcast and is being shown here for the first time. Clearly, we can see the craft hovering silently over the homes below. These large crafts are commonly referred to as beam ships, or in some cases, motherships. They gained their reputation by their reported immense size and softly glowing light emitted by the craft's operation. Approximately 38 minutes into the sighting, the ship began hovering away from his house. He followed the craft in his car and stopped along the freeway to film it hovering near an apartment complex. Minutes later, the craft flew directly over Miami's International Airport, where it hovered momentarily. The ship then flew into a residential area and accelerated out of sight. As the craft emerged from a wooded field, he was able to continue videotaping, but it wasn't long before it began accelerating again. While pacing it at over 50 miles an hour, it flew off out of sight. This slow-motion enhancement clearly shows the craft as it's speeding along the shoreline. To this day, Adrienne maintains he is still experiencing the reoccurring sightings. Since then, they have frequently appeared in UFO sighting reports. This cigar-shaped craft was filmed hovering in Rhode Island in 1967. A similar elongated UFO was videotaped in 1980 in the skies over Hagen, Germany. These pictures of a cigar-shaped UFO were taken in California. This UFO was photographed in Earth's orbit. crowds gathered in Krasnodar, Russia, to marvel at this luminous cigar-shaped UFO. This dramatic footage was later broadcast on Soviet television.
The evidence is overwhelming. No single program in history has ever amassed such a compelling collection of footage. We'll use computer analysis, optical enhancement, and expert testimony to help bring the truth to light. But first, when did these sightings begin? The evidence suggests that mankind has been visited since the dawn of time. Recently, researchers point to one undeniable event that sparked the largest wave of sightings in history: the detonation of the atomic bomb.
Unknowingly, we had sent an invitation to the universe establishing ourselves as an advanced civilization.
The Air Force has officially analyzed the motives of possible visitors from space. Here is a direct quotation from the official report. Such a civilization might observe that on Earth we now have atomic bombs. We should therefore expect at this time above all to behold such visitation.
As early as 1947, alien craft began responding to our open invitation by arriving in large numbers. If advanced civilizations wanted to monitor our nuclear technology, New Mexico was the place to be. Because of its remote location, New Mexico was the site of the military's atomic research and testing. Post-war missile tests were conducted at White Sands, and Roswell was home to the only atomic bomber squad in the world. To date, the biggest day in Roswell's history remains July 2nd, 1947, when Mac Brazel, a rancher who lived just outside of Roswell, was startled that evening by a loud explosion outside. The following day, while checking on a remote water pump on his ranch, Mac made an astounding discovery. Spread over an area 100 yards wide and 3/4 of a mile long was crashed debris. Under top-secret security, the debris was collected down to the smallest piece. The base commander had already ordered a press release announcing they had recovered a flying disc. As the news traveled around the world, the phones began to ring off the hook back at the base. The Air Force quickly realized the implications of their hasty press release and issued a cover story. In a press conference held the next day, a metallic reflector was displayed for the reporters as proof the incident was nothing more than a downed weather balloon. Recently declassified government top-secret documents confirm the Roswell incident. The report states on July 7, 1947, a secret operation had begun to assure recovery of the wreckage of an alien craft for scientific study. The Roswell incident caught the military off guard. Faced with the fear of widespread public panic, the government began the largest covert operation in history. Their objective was twofold. First, research the alien visitors and their craft, and second, divert the public's attention away from the subject of UFOs. In response to the Roswell crash, then-President Harry Truman formed a special investigative team of 12 hand-picked scientists and military officers to manage the situation. Secretly known as Majestic 12 or MJ-12, the panel's directive was to research the UFO phenomenon and keep it out of the public eye. Recently, private lawsuits and the Freedom of Information Act allowed for the release of many top-secret documents from this era. These once top-secret papers also clearly describe multiple alien vehicle recovery operations and civilian sighting reports. Even seemingly insignificant alien encounters were documented in great detail and were treated as an issue of national security. At the end of MJ-12's preliminary investigation, General Nathan F. Twining issued a top-secret memo relating their findings. The memo stated that, quote, "The phenomenon is something real and not visionary or fictitious. There are objects probably approximating the shape of a disk, of such appreciable size as to appear to be as large as man-made aircraft, yet circular or elliptical in shape, flat on the bottom and domed on the top, and making no associated sound." In his report, the general described the alien craft as capable of extreme maneuverability and very evasive when sighted or contacted by friendly aircraft.
By the early 1950s, the public was fully aware of the growing UFO phenomenon. As the number of sightings increased, the government began more research. The alien craft represented a technological advantage, And if the government was to maintain the national security, they had to control the situation. But the number of sightings made the job impossible. The public demanded an explanation.
There have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things. It is this group of observations that we now are attempting to resolve.
It was sightings like this one filmed in Kentucky that made the situation impossible to contain. The military had no choice but to try and explain the UFO sightings. Photos like these fueled public interest. This sequence was taken of a disc-shaped craft flying off the coast of the island of Trinidad. The pictures were taken by an official photographer of the Brazilian Navy aboard the naval training ship Almirante Saldanha. After the official analysis proved the craft was 120 feet in diameter, the Brazilian president presented the photographs in a press conference.
During the early 1950s, sightings were being reported in record numbers. The Air Force could barely handle the overwhelming volume of calls. If the government was to maintain secrecy, they would have to collect their own information firsthand.
The first UFO tracking project was installed in Alaska. The Air Force installed sophisticated cameras and detection equipment aboard specialized reconnaissance planes to retrieve the best possible information on the UFOs. The project was placed under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Stevens.
I remember one report where an object got in behind the trailing edge of the large wing and ahead of the smaller wing in the position, open position there, and remained for 2 or 3 minutes, and they got pictures with all of the movie cameras and the handheld cameras, including the 8x10 Fairchild camera. All of the data that was recorded by this special equipment, the cartridges, cassettes, rolls of film, and everything, after a mission with an encounter, was removed from the canisters and the equipment items and packed in a metal box and chained to an officer's wrist and flown to Washington that night. And this happened on a frequency of about 3 or 4 times a month for the whole year and a half that I was doing this in Alaska.
Despite the military's ongoing efforts to divert public attention, the UFO phenomenon took center stage. Aliens made their debut at the World's Fair, and the public was treated to a seemingly endless wave of alien movies. Many wondered why UFOs hadn't made their presence known by buzzing the nation's capital, as they had done in the movies. In July 1952, that's exactly what happened, and it happened twice. The New York Times reported formations of glowing discs maneuvered over the Capitol as eyewitnesses on the ground snapped pictures. Radar operators clocked the UFO speeds up to 7,000 miles per hour. 1 week later, the discs returned. The Air Force said what people had seen was a temperature inversion. The pictures tell a different story.
A special session was held in the Pentagon to deal with the situation. The result was a bold new program. Now the military's protocol focused on training and debunking or scientifically disproving the growing phenomenon. They thought discrediting the sightings would decrease the public interest, and so the cover-up began.
On the next Sci-Fi
Project Blue. The objectives of the program are twofold. First of all, to try to determine if the UFO phenomenon presents a threat to the security of the United States. And second, to determine if the UFO phenomenon exhibits any technological advances which could be channeled into research and development.
There's nothing to hide.
There's nothing to hide at all.
Many people were not satisfied with these explanations.
The Air Force itself has officially admitted that flying saucers exist. This statement appears in Project Saucer Case number 75.
remained a mystery. The height of the Cold War ushered in the space race. Suddenly, America found itself in a heated competition with Russia to put a man on the moon. America's attention was focused on NASA as space exploration became the nation's top priority. But as NASA soon found out, the Russians weren't the only ones who were watching.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
It was a race like mankind had never seen before. Who would be the first to conquer the vast distances of space? But what MJ-12 and the Air Force already knew, NASA was finding out for themselves. NASA's official policy is that it is not engaged in any UFO research. But NASA's own logs showed that practically all of their early Gemini and Apollo missions encountered UFOs. In 1985, NASA released UFO footage taken by their astronauts in lunar and terrestrial orbit. This film was taken by astronaut James McDivitt aboard Gemini 4. The next day, he snapped this photo of a cylindrical UFO in Earth's orbit. One day before the historical landing on the moon on July 20th, 1969, the Apollo 11 crew filmed luminous disks in orbit around the moon. On an Apollo 12 film, a bright object was observed flying around the lunar surface with great speed. Here, a gigantic dome-shaped disk was filmed in stationary orbit above the moon's surface. Here we see two UFO that have landed on the lunar surface. When we magnify the image, we can see the disks in great detail. Even though NASA doesn't officially recognize the alien craft, it has its own extensive written policies governing contact with extraterrestrial life forms. In the mid-1970s, NASA launched the Viking probe. Its mission was to map the surface of Mars. Viking relayed back these pictures of unexplainable structures from the Cydonia region of the planet. Viking's low-orbit pass photographed these structures in detail, revealing several giant pyramids and what appears to be a face carved in stone. After close examination, the face measured over 1.5 miles in length. NASA was quick to respond to the public's claims that they had discovered the proof of an alien civilization. The official explanation for the structures was that the pictures contained missing data and Viking's cameras could not transmit the remaining information. Despite NASA's official position, many astronauts have come forward with their own UFO encounters. James Lovell, Deke Slayton, James McDivitt, Wally Schirra, Gordon Cooper, and others have gone public with their encounters. In 1978, Gordon Cooper wrote a letter to the United Nations panel on UFOs stating that these are extraterrestrial vehicles visiting from other planets. In March 1989, the crew of the Space Shuttle Discovery may have had its own close encounter. A ham radio operator claims that he picked up the voice of the shuttle pilot, Colonel Blaha, speaking on a secret NASA channel.
Houston, this is Discovery. We still have the alien spacecraft under appearance.
NASA maintains that this is not Colonel Blaha's voice. Another space shuttle mission filmed several disks in high-altitude orbit traveling at several thousand miles per hour. Shortly thereafter, NASA began scrambling all shuttle transmissions. Despite the evidence, NASA maintains their official position and has explained these encounters as space debris or spatial anomalies.
The turmoil in the 1960s diverted the public's attention away from the UFO phenomenon. Incidents like the Vietnam War and Watergate aided the government's debunking program. By the early 1970s, UFOs were no longer the topic of national interest. But despite the government's successful efforts, the sightings continued to increase in numbers.
Some experts believe that this is the world's best UFO film. It was taken by Matt Lane Rutherford in Silver Springs, Maryland. Mr. Rutherford took footage after twilight as the disc hovered over his backyard. Scientists examined the footage and concluded the craft appeared to be maneuvering in its own gravitational field. Took this picture of a metallic craft as it circled his house. In 1978, a terrified housewife in Spain snapped a picture of these UFOs while watching the sunset. This footage was taken by an Australian TV crew on December the 31st, 1978. This luminous domed craft appeared to have a rim around the center and two large portholes. It maneuvered at such an incredible speed it left this track on a single frame of film. No known conventional aircraft can fly at such speeds. In 1978, the United Nations released statistics showing that since 1947, 63,144 UFO sightings were reported. That's approximately one every 4 hours. Even President Jimmy Carter had his own alien encounter. While governor of Georgia, he filed this 7-page UFO report stating he spotted a glowing object hovering for 12 minutes in the skies over Georgia. The report was personally signed by Carter himself. This dome-shaped craft was filmed by a television crew from New Zealand in January 2nd, 1979. We can clearly see the craft from the top. The disk appears to be rotating while emitting a blue glow. An identical craft was photographed in 1952 by a Brazilian journalist in Rio de Janeiro. Here we see the dome is visible from two angles and the side is surrounded by large portholes. This sighting was filmed from the parking lot of the Rio Casino Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada. When the footage was enhanced, a disc-shaped craft can be seen with a dome on the top and a series of portholes surrounding the craft. In 1991, this footage made worldwide headlines. These two discs were videotaped in a suburban neighborhood just outside Ottawa, Canada. Both UFOs landed in what appears to be a prearranged site. This footage became known as the Guardian sighting. In 1991, eyewitnesses screamed as a photographer took this picture off Manhattan Island as a disc emerged from the river and flew off. This craft was photographed rising out of the water in Australia as it docked with a smaller dark object. This UFO was spotted in Denver, Colorado, as witnesses watched from a neighbor's backyard. In the mid-1990s, startled eyewitnesses filmed these craft as they hovered silently in the night skies. In the months following, similar craft were videotaped on 3 different continents. It was rare that sightings like these gained much national attention. But President Ronald Reagan's speech to students at Falston High School soon changed all that.
Suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe. We'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our countries.
2 years later, President Reagan made international headlines when he repeated the alien theme to the General Assembly of the United Nations.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
President Reagan's speeches started the public asking questions again. The Cold War era created a defense industry based solely on high technology. As the stealth bombers rolled off the assembly line, rumors surfaced that the military was test flying recovered alien craft at a secret government base known as Area 51. If the military was going to test fly alien craft, Area 51 was the perfect place to do it. Located some 125 miles outside of Las Vegas, it is one of the least populated expanses in the United States. Area 51 is surrounded on 3 sides by military testing grounds and hidden from public view behind the Groom Mountain Range. This Russian satellite photo shows the base as it appeared in the 1960s. Since then, satellite images have shown the base has expanded immensely. Only a handful of photographs of the base exist, and until recently, the government officially denied its existence. This rare and never-before-seen footage of the base was taken by amateur photographers risking imprisonment if accidentally venturing on government land. But in the mid-1980s, the government seized the adjacent public land, closing off all access to any prying eyes. Sophisticated detection equipment monitors the public BLM land surrounding the base, and private security forces patrol to deter any unwanted lookers.
These unmarked black helicopters are used to buzz automobiles, scaring off UFO buffs hoping to snap a photo. But it's photographs like these taken over the Groom Mountain range that seemingly confirm the rumors. Very little actual footage exists of the reported test flights. This amateur videotape shows what eyewitnesses saw hover over the base for several minutes before landing. Area 51 has been called the best-known secret military base in America. The rumors subsided, and in 1996, the state of Nevada renamed the highway which runs parallel to the base. In a massive dedication ceremony open to the press, thousands watched as the governor of Nevada unveiled road signs proclaiming Highway 375 as the extraterrestrial highway.
Now, former government employee and nuclear physicist Bob Lazar breaks his silence. In this extraordinary interview, he discusses his classified work at the military's top secret saucer research facility known as S4.
Bob Lazar is a nuclear physicist specializing in advanced propulsion systems. In 1989, he was hired by the military to back-engineer the propulsion system of an extraterrestrial craft. Lazar worked at what is undoubtedly the most top-secret research facility in the world, S4.
There was absolutely no ET craft, ET technology, anything like that at Area 51. This is why S4 was made specifically to separate it there. People at Area 51 do not have the clearance.
According to Lazar, the military had not been test flying alien crafts at Area 51. Rather, the discs many had videotaped and photographed were actually being flown out of S4, just several miles away.
The S4 facility is an area just off the Papoose lake bed, dry lake bed. And it consists of 9 hangars. The hangars have sloped doors on them with a sand texture coating. At the time that I was working there at McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas, there was a Special Projects EG&G building. When I was told to go to work, I drove there, parked my car there, got in a plane at the airport, flew to Groom Lake, where I deplaned and waited for a bus, and the bus drove me down to S4. The first disc I saw, I believe it was the second, or I think it was the third time I was up there. Upon seeing it, it struck me that, well, this explains all the UFO sightings. Not thinking that it was an extraterrestrial craft, that this must have been some advanced form of fighter that we've been working on for years, and people have just caught it being tested, so on and so forth. And it never even occurred to me, even though I was looking at an extraterrestrial vehicle, that this wasn't man-made. I give everything nicknames there. The one I worked on was kind of sleek looking, and I gave it the name of the sport model. There was one that looked like a Jell-O mold. There was one that looked like a top hat. There was a disc that was turned up on its side, and it had a large projectile hole with the metal bent outwards on it. I can only surmise they were testing it to see if a projectile could penetrate it.
Alien crafts like the one Bob worked on had already been sighted throughout the world. But until Lazar entered the disc, he thought it was man-made.
It probably really hit me when I got inside the craft and looked around and began to understand how the craft was operated, and finally grasped the whole project as a whole, as what we were doing, the fact that we weren't building this thing, we were trying to find out how it was made. We were back engineering it. When I first got to look inside the craft, all I can say, it's an ominous feeling. You walk in there and it feels as if you shouldn't be there. I know that sounds kind of corny, but it's a real ominous feeling. It's not an exciting feeling. It brings up a whole lot of questions in your mind. I only witnessed one test flight up close, officially. That I was just inside the hangar. The craft lifted off the ground, virtually noiseless, other than a small corona discharge on the bottom of the craft, indicating the presence of high voltage. That dissipated at about 30 feet, and it stood there completely silently, and moved over to the left and to the right, and sat back down. That was the entire test. This was quite quite a scientific feat to lift something completely silently, under control, and perform a maneuver like that.
Bad feeling about this.
Facility. Lazar learned how these craft operate by studying their propulsion system.
I had to hang upside down in there to see the lower level, essentially. And there were 3 large gravity amplifiers. These devices looked like about a 2-foot diameter, 4-foot long piece of pipe hanging by a smaller piece of pipe from the level above, and they can be independently positioned. And that's what emits the gravitational waves that propel the craft. They'll use one gravity generator to lift the craft off the ground. And as opposed to what we're used to, for instance, a plane, once it's in the air, we envision thrust or some force coming out the back of it to push it forward. The crafts work completely opposite of that. What they do is once they're hovering in the air, they'll swing the gravity, 2 remaining gravity generators up in front of them and create a distortion, essentially a downhill, and the craft rolls downhill for infinity.
As seen here, these craft don't always fly in a similar fashion. They have been seen and photographed flying in radically different positions. Lazar explains.
There's what they call Omicron configuration, where the craft is using one generator, or Delta configuration, where it's utilizing all 3. Delta configuration would be for space travel. Essentially, the craft will tilt up on its side, focus the 3 gravity generators to a single point, and move through space that way. It's always chasing a little distortion. That's why they look goofy when they fly around at low speed. Gravity will vary somewhat, and you will get odd movements of the craft. So its low speed mode is kind of unstable for the most part.
Lazar was also able to shed light on one of the phenomenon that's commonly seen in so many sightings.
If you were going to see one of these crafts at night operating, it would appear really as a glowing ball or just a bright light in the sky from a distance. Even close up, you'd see a glowing halo around it. What you're dealing with is a high energy source in essentially a gas atmosphere, oxygen, nitrogen. And when you apply enough energy to a gas molecule, they emit photons, they emit light. Well, when you're on the outside, you pretty much think, how could they keep something like this secret? It's a crime against science, it's a crime against the people and all that. But, your feelings change once you're privy to the information. Before I was at S4, I was more or less one of the guys that thought, all these government conspiracy and UFO buffs and things like that were complete lunatics. Obviously, the ET craft do exist. Something had to build them, so there must be aliens. And since there are, and the craft are there must be some sort of factory and an entire civilization somewhere. And if in fact that is true, and it apparently is, then there must be others.
One of the least known aspects of the UFO phenomenon may be the most chilling. With today's sophisticated computer technology and special effects, it's possible to fake a picture or alter video. But this modern technology hasn't always existed. We've uncovered startling new evidence that suggests that mankind has been visited since the beginning of recorded history.
This is the oldest known picture of a UFO sighting. Or is it? The earliest recorded sightings occurred in Pakistan over 7,000 years ago. In this dramatic Stone Age cave painting, we can clearly see a human-like being wearing what appears to be a helmet, complete with antenna. In the background, we can see a classic saucer-shaped craft. Archaeologists discovered this 15,000-year-old cave painting in southern France showing disc-shaped craft flying over ritual hunting grounds. So many saucer-shaped craft were depicted, the archaeology team put together a catalog to illustrate the various shapes and sizes. In a Japanese cave painting, we see a large, luminous craft hovering over a crowd watching from below. Throughout the Middle Ages, we can also see evidence of similar flying ships. In some cases, the craft resembles saucers photographed in modern times. This fresco in a monastery in Yugoslavia shows a manned craft flying above the people below. This painting was found in one of the oldest churches in Russia. It shows two flying discs with on-looking faces observing the crucifixion. Much about man's oldest civilization, the Sumerians, remains a mystery, except that the remnants of their ancient culture inexplicably appears even today, and their preserved records show contact with alien beings. A recent crop formation found in England depicts two worlds in contact above the Sumerian symbol, translated to read, "The nobles with their flying starships." As shown in these videotapes, most of these crop formations coincide with UFO sightings. In 1975, the first documented contact case took place in Switzerland. A farmer named Billy Meyer made international headlines by taking hundreds of photographs and filming 20 minutes of what some consider is the best UFO footage in the world. Edward Billy Meyer is the eyewitness in one of the most famous yet controversial UFO cases in history. He gained worldwide attention by going public with his alien encounters. Despite the clarity of his photos and films, they remain controversial because he claims to have been in contact with the alien visitors. On January the 28th, 1975, he had his first sighting in the Swiss countryside of Hinwell. According to Billy, he heard a low-pitched hum as he looked up to see a silver disc-shaped craft descending upon him. He was able to snap off a few shots with his camera. 1 month later, on March 8th, 1975, Billy photographed this ship moving along the tree line. This was one of the first UFO pictures to be analyzed by optical computer enhancement. An independent lab confirmed the photograph had not been altered and was considered genuine. March 29, 1976 marked the appearance of a new disc Meyer later referred to as a variation Type 4 craft. Shortly thereafter, Billy was able to obtain metal samples from one of his encounters. This electron microscope footage of the metal samples was part of an analysis conducted in the United States. Two laboratories independently confirmed the combination of metals were intricately machined, cold fused together, and could not have been produced here on Earth. Shortly after Billy's encounters began, he started to bring his 8mm movie camera with him and filmed several amazing sequences of hovering craft. Perhaps the most striking piece of evidence in the Meyer case is this film clip of a metallic disc hovering over a road below. In this daylight shot, we can clearly see the graceful motion of the metallic disc as two different cars drive directly under it. Yet despite Meyer's efforts and the hard physical evidence, skeptics maintained that the photos and footage were too good to be true. By April 4th, 1978, the contacts had stopped. Billy claims to have had a total of 105 sightings over the 3-year period ever recorded. Guillermo Arguin from Mexico City was the first to come forward with this footage. When optically enhanced, it clearly reveals the rotating motion of the metallic disc. Meanwhile, 85 miles away in Puebla, a cameraman took this footage of a nearly identical craft. Split-screen enhancement shows the striking similarities between the two. Another witness filmed this craft. The computer enhancement reveals further details of the craft during the mass sighting. This footage was videotaped from the northeast section of Mexico City. Enhancement reveals a pulsating field on the lower half of the craft. Miguel Torres filmed this disc as it moved through the central part of the city. When optically enhanced, a corona discharge or burst of colored light can be clearly seen on the bottom of the craft. Of the 2,000 hours of videos taken, these 6 were picked for comparative analysis. All reveal the same metallic-shaped discs as photographed from the different parts of the city. David Froning, a field propulsion expert, was brought in to analyze this footage.
You see the fact that it probably is of a metallic-like structure because you can't see reflections off the edges. The phenomena you see here would be indicative of an effective field propulsion system. I should mention that we do not know how at the present time to perfect effective field propulsion. If there was just nothing here, it would not be as dramatic.
In the days following the eclipse, the sightings continued to grow in numbers. This luminous object was filmed as it flew across the city. Optical enhancements reveal the craft as it travels at a high rate of speed. This UFO was videotaped from an apartment balcony in the city. The photographer filmed this craft as it maneuvered around an industrial building and vanished out of sight. While filming this car commercial, a television crew was caught off guard as they filmed a luminous craft streaking across the sky. This rare UFO formation was taped over at Lisco. Similar formations of craft have been videotaped in Florida and in Belgium. Split window comparison shows the similarities. Public outcry for an official explanation forced the government to respond to the mass sightings. In the only press conference held on the subject, the mayor of Atlisco asked his citizens to remain calm as there were no reports of injuries or damages caused by the alien craft. In one of the more dramatic moments, this amateur video captured a metallic disc traveling through the clouds as it stopped in midair and reversed direction. No conventional aircraft can fly in this manner. UFO were even present during their Independence Day celebration. A military parade and a massive air show commemorated the occasion. As jets flew overhead, a metallic disc suddenly appeared. When the jets tried to intercept the craft, it accelerated, leaving them in its wake.
In the last hour, we've shown you photographs, film clips, videotape, government files, and expert testimony documenting one of the greatest mysteries of our time. The evidence is overwhelming. From ancient artifacts to modern-day sightings, the evidence presents itself. Now, only you can decide. Are we really alone?
Everywhere. But the search for proof of extraterrestrial intelligence has produced disappointing results. The best so-called evidence has only been a few photographs and film clips. But now, all that's about to change. Since 1985, more than 15 million Americans have reportedly witnessed unidentified flying objects. But despite the seemingly overwhelming evidence, mainstream science has chosen to ignore the subject. But now, for the first time in history, one of the greatest mysteries of this century is unraveling. A former government scientist has come forward to discuss the military's classified work on extraterrestrial spacecraft. Human advances in technology have exploded in a million directions and show no signs of slowing down. The ever-increasing pace of achievement in the last several decades is unparalleled in human history. The high cost of developing and producing these technologies has limited the number of contenders from the private sector, leaving the government and large corporate businesses on the cutting edge of new discoveries. Always in the public eye, big business competes for high-paying contracts, working night and day to invent or further develop the next big thing to satisfy the masses. The government, on the other hand, must conceal information concerning national security that, for obvious reasons, should not be public knowledge. But when it comes to matters concerning the welfare of our planet, the living beings on it, or potential clues to the mysteries of the universe, many believe it should be our right to know. The end of World War II and the invention of the atomic bomb signaled a new era of international mistrust. Since the earliest days of the Cold War, which coincides with the Roswell incident and the start of the modern UFO era, the military has been especially secretive about its advances and achievements, while always searching for the perfect weapon or super sophisticated tool of espionage. High-tech surveillance equipment around the world, and even in space, has allowed global intelligence to see and be aware of many things that the common civilian cannot even begin to imagine. The military recruits many talented civilians when special expertise is required. And propulsion systems expert Bob Lazar claims he was one of them. In this exclusive interview, he gives his detailed account of his employment with the Department of Naval Intelligence at the top-secret facility known as S4, where, according to Bob, he was hired to work on recovered alien spacecraft. S4 is located 125 miles north of Las Vegas and 15 miles south of Groom Lake. This now not-so-secret military base at Groom Lake, Nevada, is known as Area 51, or dreamland as insiders like to call it. Born in 1959 in Coral Gables, Florida, Bob has lived much of his life in Las Vegas, Nevada. With degrees in physics and electronics from MIT and Caltech, he has dabbled in everything from chemistry to fireworks in an effort to understand the finer points of propulsion. He has even assembled a jet car with a 22,000 horsepower engine salvaged from a Navy F-3D Skynight that is capable of land speeds of over 350 miles per hour. Fate took a serious turn for Bob in 1982. Arriving early for a lecture at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico given by Dr. Edward Teller, one of the inventors of the atomic bomb, Bob was able to meet and talk to the famous physicist. Coincidentally, Dr. Teller was reading the local paper, The Monitor, with a featured front-page article on Bob, and the two struck up a conversation. Later, Bob sent Dr. Teller his resume for consideration, and soon after, Bob was hired by the Los Alamos National Laboratory. This Los Alamos-based directory lists Bob as an employee. By 1989, Bob was brought into the top-secret program at S4 known as Project Galileo. In the following interview, Bob reveals many details of this amazing experience.
Did you witness any disk technology at Area 51?
No, there was absolutely no ET craft, ET technology, anything like that at Area 51. This is why S4 was made specifically to separate it there. People at Area 51 do not have the clearance.
How long were you employed at S4, and when were you hired?
When was I hired at S4? I guess early '89, and I was probably there only about 6 months or so, on a very infrequent basis.
How were you transported to and from work?
At the time that I was working there at McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas, there was a Special Projects EG&G building. When I was told to go to work, I drove there, parked my car there, and got in a plane at the airport, flew to Groom Lake, where I deplaned and waited for a bus, and the bus drove me down to S4. The S4 facility is an area just off the Papoose lake bed, dry lake bed, and it consists of 9 hangars. The hangars have sloped doors on them with a sand texture coating. Around the opposite end of the hangars, there's the standard entrance where you're dropped off at, go through a security check, and inside there's a small complex. There is some office space, there's several laboratories, the hangars themselves, of course, and a few other places. I didn't have free rein to go wherever I wanted to. Everywhere I went to, I was essentially escorted, so that was really all about that I saw.
Inside the facility, what was the basic layout? Were there underground levels?
I don't think there were any underground levels to it, though there could have been. I don't think it was an extensive underground facility. It just looked like an installation that was butt up against a mountain. And I didn't see any evidence of any stairs going down, elevators, or, but like I said, I don't know. There could have been, and I just might not have been permitted in those areas. It's difficult to really surmise how long it had been operational. Everything did look fairly new. By that I mean I don't think this installation was there in the early 70s. Nothing was worn. Things looked fairly freshly painted. So, as a ballpark guess, I would say it would really surprise me if the installation was older than 5, 7, 10 years, something like that.
Lots of scientists killed in the project. What exactly happened there?
Allegedly, obviously, I didn't see this and I don't know it to be fact, but this is what I was told, that I was hired to replace one of a couple people that were killed while working on one of the reactors from one of the crafts. Apparently, they, for whatever reason, cut open an operating reactor and the device exploded, killing both of them. The scientists that were killed there Allegedly, the detonation from the explosion was fairly large. It would have rivaled a small tactical nuke. So it was done at the Nevada test site, and it was to be passed off as an unannounced nuclear test.
Did you have any direct contact or communication with aliens?
No, not at all. How tall it was from what I could see, I couldn't tell because I only saw a portion of the photograph, but if everything else you see is correct, I would imagine it was 3.5 or 4 feet tall. But there again, you know, all I had to see was a photograph, and you know, I didn't have much to go on.
What was the incident in 1979 that brought the alien exchange program of information to a halt?
Again, this is a story that was relayed to me. And allegedly what happened in '79, there was some sort of information exchange going on where there were actual live aliens at the facility. And at one particular point, there was an area where some security personnel went to enter. And apparently, because not the sidearms, but the bullets in the sidearms, from what I understand, if they would have entered the area, the bullets would have detonated. And supposedly one of the creatures tried to stop the security personnel from entering the area, and a fight ensued. And the bottom line from the altercation was that the security personnel, I don't remember how many were involved, but were all killed, and they died of head wounds, and that's all that I heard of that story.
What was your job description at S4?
My official job description was a senior staff physicist. I don't know if I actually had that position when I was there, because I was there so infrequently. I wasn't supervising anyone, so that was the official position I was hired under. But whether or not I actually acted in that capacity, I don't know.
What was the size of the staff working on Project Galileo?
Well, there were 22 people employed there totally.
And that was specifically for the Galileo project?
No, for the entire project. There were 22 people with majestic clearance. I had majestic clearance. Majestic clearance was designated as clearance 38 levels above Q clearance, and Q clearance is the civilian top secret clearance.
When did you see your first disc?
The first disc I saw, I believe it was the second, or I think it was the third time I was up there. Normally the bus pulled around to the opposite end of the facility, which was the main entrance, and that's where we went in. On this particular occasion, it pulled up to one of the hangar doors, which were normally closed, and the last one was open. We came out, and I saw the disc in the hangar. Upon seeing it, it struck me that, well, this explains all the UFO sightings. Not thinking that it was an extraterrestrial craft, that this must have been some advanced form of fighter that we've been working on for years, and you know, people have just caught it being tested, so on and so forth. And it never even occurred to me, even though I was looking at an extraterrestrial vehicle, that this wasn't man-made.
When did you realize the craft was not of earthly origin?
Well, it probably really hit me when I got inside the craft and looked around and began to understand how the craft was operated and finally grasped the whole project as a whole, as what we were doing, the fact that we weren't building this thing, we were trying to find out how it was made. We were back engineering it.
What is back engineering?
Well, back engineering is taking a finished product and finding out how the device or product was produced, and essentially determining whether or not you can duplicate it.
Now, scientists aside, what was your emotional response? What were you thinking were the implications to the world or man in general from these revelations?
I really didn't think about implications of that sort. As far as emotionally, people have asserted that, boy, that must have been the most exciting time in your life, and that's not the way it was. When I first got to look inside the craft, all I can say, it's an ominous feeling. You walk in there and it feels as if you shouldn't be there. I know that sounds kind of corny, but it's a real ominous feeling. It's not an exciting feeling. It brings up a whole lot of questions in your mind. Well, where did this come from? And you know that they won't give you the answers to the whole story, but it's that's the only way I can describe it.
I would like to talk to you about a recent discovery in the Antarctic.
It produces a gravity wave, which is similar to the gravity wave that the Earth produces. However, the craft phase shifts the wave. In other words, it turns the wave not really in an opposite polarity, but something to that effect, where it will work against the natural gravity wave of the Earth, and it produces lift in that effect.
Is there any internal protection for the crew? Does the craft generate a gravitational field inside the craft itself?
Well, the craft generates its own gravitational field. Being inside that field essentially doesn't shield you, but essentially you're in, and this is a terrible way to say it, almost in a different realm, because you're now influenced only by that gravitational field. For instance, people wonder how a craft like this can make a turn at such high speed, a 90-degree turn, when they would imagine people slamming up against the wall or something to that effect. Well, that really wouldn't happen. Inertia would have no effect. You're in a distortion, and don't forget that gravity distorts time and space, so really nothing is going to influence you while you're in there.
Describe the gravity amplifiers for us and some of their different operating configurations.
There are 3 amplifiers. The craft can operate on a single one, can lift off the ground. The way in which it gets propelled are 2 different ways. There's what they call Omicron configuration, where the craft is using one generator, or a Delta configuration, where it's utilizing all 3. Delta configuration would be for space travel. Essentially, the craft will tilt up on its side, as opposed to a science fiction movie where you see a flying saucer moving around. The craft will tilt up on its side, focus the 3 gravity generators to a single point, and move through space that way. Moving around the source of gravity is a problem to a disk because it's interference, essentially. So what they do is they work with that interference to their benefit. They'll use one gravity generator to lift the craft off the ground. And as opposed to what we're used to, for instance, a plane, once it's in the air, we envision thrust or some force coming out the back of it to push it forward. The crafts work completely opposite of that. What they do is once they're hovering in the air, they'll swing the 2 remaining gravity generators up in front of them and create a distortion, essentially a downhill, and the craft rolls downhill for infinity. It's always chasing a little distortion. That's why they look goofy when they fly around at low speed, because they're essentially, and any time you run over, the gravity field around the Earth is not completely constant and stable. Depending on the minerals and density of the Earth underneath it, the gravity will vary somewhat, and you will get odd movements of the craft. So its low speed mode is kind of unstable for the most part. I only witnessed one test flight up close officially. That I was just inside the hangar. The test was going off probably just as the sun was going down, and it was a low performance test. I believe there were some pilots or test pilots in the craft. The craft must have been retrofitted to fit them, because the seating arrangements were really not accommodating. They were in radio communication with the craft, which is kind of surprising to me, because the gravity waves that the craft was producing should have distorted the radio waves also. So apparently there's something there that I don't understand. The craft lifted off the ground, virtually noiseless, other than a small corona discharge in the bottom of the craft, indicating the presence of high voltage. That dissipated at about 30 feet, and it stood there completely silently, and moved over to the left, to the right, and sat back down. That was the entire test. However, that was an extremely impressive test. Maybe to someone that really knows little about science or anything, that wouldn't be a whole lot, but you have to realize this craft was about 52 feet in diameter. I don't know exactly how much it weighed, but it weighed a lot. And this was quite a scientific feat, to lift something completely silently, under control, and perform a maneuver like that. The craft itself was, I assume it was metal. It was cold to the touch, that's why I say it was metal. But it was a brushed aluminum, actually just an unfinished stainless steel, not shiny, finish to it. Had no seams. It was as if it was injection molded from one giant die. I was completely amazed. I can't really reflect on how it made me feel, but that was exciting.
How would you define gravity? Could you describe in layman's terms its basic principles for us?
Gravity is something difficult to explain, because it's something that we essentially don't understand. It's just something that we can observe. Not much is really known about gravity. There are many theories about it, but they are just mainly theories. There's theories of gravitons, which allege that these subatomic particles that act like an attractive force like gravity, that exchange between two pieces of matter. There is also a theory that gravity is a form of wave, an electromagnetic wave. But basically, gravity is a force. It's the attraction. It's the inherent property of matter to have gravity, a mutual attraction for each other, and it's basically all that we really know. Modern science, current science, right now, identifies one gravity. It's one force in nature. Apparently, through research at S4 or information gained from one of the crafts they were researching there, it appears that there are two different forms of gravity. One form works on an atomic scale, on subatomic particles, holding pieces of matter, holding atoms themselves together. Another works on a larger scale, the scale we're most familiar with, holding planets in orbit, holding ourselves to the ground, things of that sort. Because it produces a gravitational field, I wouldn't say the craft is invisible during the day. However, if you're under the craft, because of the way the gravity is being used, gravity bends time and space, and it bends light. If you are looking underneath the craft or from certain vantage points, you will actually see what's above the craft. It's really a trick of the way light bends under the influence of gravity. For instance, we can see stars that are behind the sun, that are blocked from our view by the sun. The reason we can see them is because the sun has a tremendous gravitational field, and it's bending the light around it where we can see the star. Space-time and gravity are all essentially interrelated. They all act on one another. Gravity bends space Gravity also distorts time. When you vary one, you essentially vary the other two. If you, as an example, if you have a massive body, say a planet or something that's making a lot of gravity, producing a lot of gravitational waves, if you will, it distorts space, it bends space to it. It also slows down time. These things aren't theories, we know them to be true. We cannot artificially create this because we can't create gravity. But this is how they're all interrelated. Just a couple of them are the fact that as your speed increases, so does your mass proportionally. In other words, the more energy you put in to go faster begins to slow you down by the fact that it's converted into mass. You have other problems like just traveling at such an extreme velocity, navigational problems, the fact that you might run into little tiny micrometeorites at speeds like this. They would undoubtedly destroy your craft. There's just a whole host of problems that you're going to run into just attempting to do something like that. Aside from the fact the amount of energy required to accelerate to the speed of light is horrendous.
Could you briefly describe Project Looking Glass and Project Sidekick for us?
Project Sidekick was another project going on with Galileo. Galileo was the project that I was involved in. Sidekick dealt with any of the weapon potential of the craft, whether or not the craft had a weapon in it or could it be used as a weapon, but it had something to do with some sort of particle beam configuration where the gravity generator can be used as a lens to focus a weapon of some sort, similar to the SDI device we were working on in the 80s, but with the potential of a focusing device using the gravity generator.
And Project Looking Glass?
Project Looking Glass dealt with the distortion, the fact that there's a time distortion, essentially looking back in time, and by that I do not mean looking back years ago to see the wagon train days. They're looking for distortions that are milliseconds in time, and what that was used for, I don't know, but that was just observing the time, the time distortion, time dilation phenomena of the craft in operation.
What is element 115? Is it found here on Earth, or is it strictly an extraterrestrial material?
115 is strictly an extraterrestrial material. It probably occurs naturally in some other places, maybe other star systems. Some people not familiar with science or chemistry say, well, that's ridiculous. All the elements occur on Earth, you know. But that's not true. There are elements on the periodic chart that aren't found on Earth. I believe the Heavy Ion Research Lab in Darmstadt, Germany, has reached element 112 recently. So 115 isn't that far away. And when they synthesize it, it's not like they're making a couple ounces of it. They're talking about 1 or 2 atoms of it. To make any usable quantity of a heavy element like that is virtually impossible. Element 115 is in the top of the reactor. And the base of the reactor apparently is a small, something similar to a cyclotron. It's a particle accelerator. A particle is accelerated to high speed and then deflected up a small tube, and it's aimed at the 115. This transmutes the 115, similar to the way we do that in a normal particle accelerator. This causes a reaction, a radiation emission that we really haven't seen before. It produces antimatter. This antimatter is guided down a tuned tube and reacts with a gas. When matter and antimatter react, they convert to 100% energy. This energy is converted, heat energy, is converted to electrical power in the reactor itself. This is done through a thermoelectric converter. And this electrical power is used to power other subsystems on the craft, though there is no wiring, you know, as we would know it. Also, that's almost a byproduct of the reactor. The reactor also sets up a gravitational wave from the 115 being bombarded. This gravitational wave is present at the top of the reactor and is essentially guided in the same way microwaves are guided through tuned tubes. And this goes to their amplifying cavities and through the projectors that are in the bottom of the craft.
With the gravity generators running, is there thermal radiation danger to the crew?
There is no thermal radiation while the reactor's running. The thermionic generator is 100% efficient, which is in violation of the first law of thermodynamics. But in fact, it works. Element 115 is stable. And for those familiar with chemistry, we know that elements with higher atomic numbers have shorter and shorter half-lives. However, when you reach a certain point, they call it the island of stability. There is a place, and we've theorized this for a long time. Somewhere around 114 to 116, there should be an area in there where the nucleus of the atom is geometrically stable with protons and neutrons, where it no longer decays. It's not radioactive. 115 is, in fact, this element. In fact, it does occur again somewhere around element 247. Of course, we're nowhere near synthesizing that. We can only predict things like that, but that's where 115 is.
Did the aliens, give us element 115 in large quantities?
Whether or not it was given to us, I can't answer that question. However, I was told that we have 500 pounds by one of my co-workers. How it was obtained and where exactly it came from, I don't know. Whether it came in one of the crafts or it was separate cargo somewhere, anyone can speculate. But I was told that was the figure.
You were able to get away with a sample of element 115. How much did you get away with?
No comment.
Unofficially, while off the base, what did you see?
The test flights I saw off the base, actually the best test flight was witnessed by my friends who I had brought out there. At the exact moment the craft was hopping around and doing some really impressive maneuvers, I had turned around and I think was looking for the video camera or something to that effect, but I missed some of the most impressive maneuvers. But the craft was similar to what was done before that I had seen close up, other than the fact that it went above the mountain range, moved a much greater distance at a much higher rate of speed.
How were you able to find out about the test flight schedules?
The test flight schedules were told to me, specifically because I was probably going to have to be present during those times. And at that time, the test flights were taking place on Wednesday nights. And from what they said, that was because that was statistically the least amount of traffic in the area. And that's all that they were concerned about.
Does the propulsion system release any sort of discharge or exhaust?
There was a high voltage discharge on the bottom of the craft, but as far as there being an exhaust, there was none.
Why did they appear as glowing balls of light in the night sky?
Well, that's kind of the same reason why a neon light or a fluorescent light lights up. What you're dealing with is a high energy source in essentially a gas atmosphere, oxygen, nitrogen. And when you apply enough energy to a gas molecule, they emit photons, they emit light. And I don't think it's anything, it's really a byproduct of how the craft operates. When it's emitting that much energy, the gas surrounding the craft emits light. The same reason why lightning is visible. You have a huge electrical discharge, and the gas emits light in the form of lightning bolt. If you were going to see one of these crafts at night operating, it would appear really as a glowing ball or just a bright light in the sky from a distance. Even close up, you'd see a glowing halo around it. This is typically what you'd see in your normal UFO sighting, if you've heard them a lot. However, keep in mind that lights in the sky are caused by much more common things than flying saucers.
Tell us a little more about the aurora you witnessed taking off out of Area 51.
It was a large craft, and the one glimpse I got of it was from the rear, and it had two huge square exhausts with vanes in them. And it was just, it sounded more like a rocket than a jet. I don't know. I even think he did mention that it was liquid methane powered, but there again, working on the disk technology, I really could care less what was rolling around at Area 51, but it did catch my eye.
As a result of going public, have there been any attempts made on your life?
One day when I was getting on Interstate 15, driving down Charleston Boulevard, a car came up alongside of me, and I thought he was just trying to race me to get on the freeway. This was after I had left the project. It was a white, boxy-looking car. Exactly what make and model, I don't know. But I accelerated to get on the freeway to go fast, and there was a gunshot, and the back of the car was hit, and I skidded off into the median. And I stopped, and I was frightened, and I just stood there because I thought the guy was going to be alongside of me and just shoot me. I had nothing to do. I was essentially paralyzed with fear, and I waited there, and then nothing else happened. And do I know it was a government agent trying to kill me? No. Could it have been a drive-by shooting? Maybe. So it was an attempt on my life, but by who specifically, I don't know. Though I was threatened before I had left. They threatened my wife's life and my life, so I can only put two and two together and say that they were kind of pissed at me.
In an earlier interview, you had mentioned that they had put a gun to your head. Tell us about that.
That was after we were caught out when I had the test flight schedule, and I brought some friends out to show them the disc test. We got caught out there, and the following day I was debriefed down at Indian Springs Air Force Base. And I was in the room with the security guards that caught us, my supervisor and some other people, and some other security personnel. They were essentially grilling me about security and, how could I possibly bring people out there? And I guess I wasn't as responsive as they would like, and they got in my face, and one of them pulled a sidearm out, just pushed it against me.
Have you maintained any contacts with your colleagues out at S4?
No, I never heard from anyone other than for a very brief time after I left. Dennis, who was my supervisor, did try and make contact with me at the meeting place was the Union Plaza Hotel, and I took a friend of mine, Gene Huff, down there, and another friend, a former colleague and scientist from Los Alamos, and we saw him, but I also did recognize some security personnel walking around there from S4. So whether or not it was a setup or what was going on or he was trying to talk to me, we never found out, and we left. It just was a real strange situation. I never heard from him since.
As we enter the 21st century, how has your experience changed your beliefs?
Well, if you want to word the question, how are my opinions changed? I would say considerably. Before I was at S4, I was more or less one of the guys that thought, all these government conspiracy and UFO buffs and things like that were complete lunatics. I even remember before I was involved there, a friend showed me a little newspaper clipping and said John Lear was giving a lecture who was touting that aliens from another world came to Earth and there's 70 different species. And I remember laughing on the phone that this guy had lost his mind. And I was also under the impression that, boy, the government's all for the people and they, they're out here to protect us and all that. After the experiences I had there, everything is completely turned around. The government is doing everything but looking out for us. I mean, the only thing they're looking out is for themselves. Obviously, the ET craft do exist. Something had to build them, so there must be aliens. And since there are, and the craft are there must be some sort of factory and an entire civilization somewhere. And if in fact that is true, and it apparently is, then there must be others. Actual crafts and technology from another world. And that's probably the most important event in history. It kind of moved from science fiction into reality. in my mind. And it really just, I guess, opened my eyes.
All said and done, would you do this over again? What would you do differently?
I would probably have played along for a longer time. I would like to have known a little bit more about the technology and probably kept quiet if I could have. And possibly never have said anything. I almost wish I had done that. You know, it's it's really only caused headaches and problems. But I believe if I was given the opportunity again to go back in time and redo it, I think I pretty much would have just shut up and gone along with the program. I would have much preferred that instead of the Navy or whoever it was that hand-picked a few renegade scientists here and there, that they turn it over to some more qualified people. Obviously, I was not the most qualified person on propulsion or field propulsion or anything of that sort. I was just some guy. I mean, they could have picked, I could have named 10 or 12 other guys that were more qualified than me. But, you know, if they turned it over to the scientific community and not just a couple guys here in the United States, I mean, you need a large group of people in a large lab to research what's going on there, not a little quiet installation. It's the security itself that prevents them from getting anywhere. I mean, they never do work hand in hand. You can't have a military mind. Science itself must communicate. You have to have a free exchange of ideas. That's how things progress. And when you clamp down on a security system like that, where you work in isolated groups and ideas cannot be exchanged, you don't get anywhere, and that's the problem they have.
What does the future hold for Bob Lazar?
Well, I'm not really involved in any of that stuff anymore. That's kind of put behind me. I have my own businesses that I work at, some computer graphics, some consultation, other technical jobs, radiation detectors, and a few other things like that. So really, I just go about my life, and that's, you know, something that happened that was fantastic, and it's over, but it's kind of hard to shake it loose. But eventually I will, and that'll be that. I think all the surveillance and everything stopped. I don't think anyone's bothering to monitor me. I've said everything that I know. It's been all over the place, so it's kind of a done deal. As far as whether or not there are any craft out there, I believe, you know, they were out and gone in probably the late '89, early '90, and the only thing people see now out there are, you know, either flares or planes coming into land, but that's about it.
Did you have an interest in flying saucers or science fiction in general as a child?
I was never interested in flying saucers as a child. Science fiction, you know, I watched Star Trek, I guess, with everyone else back then, but for the most part, yeah, I didn't even believe in flying saucers up until I was employed at S4.
But this amazing, flying, structured craft has no earthly explanation. It was seen over the small farming village of Kibbutz Hatzor for 3 consecutive nights in August of 1996. This video, shot by a young resident of the kibbutz, shows a bizarre-looking, partially lit craft with strange red markings and rectangular shapes. When the camera zooms in, we see what appears to be a light on the craft's left side take on amazing structure. The structure, some say, resembles a huge flying building with hallways. 17-year-old Amiche Shoah was stunned to be awakened by the strange, bright object in the night sky. He watched in amazement as it hovered above for hours. He waited for its return the next night, video camera in hand. By the third night, word of the strange craft had spread, and some 60 members of the kibbutz came out to see it in all its glorious color. This time, Amiche's batteries failed, but he managed to film the odd craft again using a neighbor's camera. Look what he managed to capture on tape. The structure is so massive that the illuminated portion is said to represent only 5 to 7% of its actual size. Is this the design of some otherworldly architect? As incredible as it sounds, some UFO researchers claim it could be housing alien inhabitants, giant aliens as described in the Bible.